Critical thinking arguments about causes, practice problems. So we're going to look at a couple of practice problems that involve arguments about causes and evaluate them using the rules of Chapter 5. Let's start with this one about the war in Vietnam. Serving in the military causes people to earn less money later in life. A decade after their military service, men who were drafted into the Vietnam War in the early 1970s earned about 85% as much as similar men who had not been drafted. Since people were chosen randomly for the draft, it can't be that future income caused people to be drafted, or that some other factor caused both being drafted and lower incomes. So to begin with, let's identify the causal claim made by this argument. You can see it in the first sentence. It even uses the word cause. Serving in the military causes people to earn less money later in life. So now let's start going through the rules from Chapter 5. Rule 18 says causal arguments start with correlations. How well does this argument state the correlation behind its causal claim? The answer is pretty well. It occurs in sentence 2. A decade after their military service, men who were drafted into the Vietnam War in the early 1970s earned about 85% as much as similar men who had not been drafted. So there is a correlation between being drafted and earning less over your lifetime. Rule 19 says correlations may have alternate explanations. Does this argument do a good job of raising other explanations as possibilities? The answer is mixed at best. The third sentence does introduce alternate explanations, so that's good. It says, since people were chosen randomly for the draft, it can't be that future income caused people to be drafted, or that some other factor caused both being drafted and lower incomes. So this is, on the one hand, raising the possibility of alternate explanations as opposed to ignoring them entirely. However, it does not do a very thorough job. It just discusses the possibility of retroactive causation, i.e. the future causing the past, which everyone knows is implausible. And it also just raises other possible factors without naming any specifically, or really taking the time to figure out what the other possible factors are and how plausible they are. So overall, even though it technically follows Rule 19, it does not do a great job of raising specific alternate explanations. Rule 20 says work towards the most likely explanation. Does this argument do a good job of proving that its favored explanation is the best one? The answer is no. On the one hand, the argument is correct that future events cannot cause past events. And also, it's correct that it's a plausible explanation that being drafted lowers your later earnings because of an economic concept called opportunity cost. Someone who's serving in the military pays a large opportunity cost for those years because they're not able to work, gain experience in a job or career, or have education or some type of training during that time. So when they go back and re-enter the workforce, they're going to be behind where they otherwise would have been. So it does identify a plausible explanation for the correlation. However, it does not provide any specific reason or evidence for why this preferred explanation is better than the alternates. Another explanation that it should have raised per Rule 19 is the possibility that wealthier families or families with higher incomes were able to have their sons evade the draft because they had more political or legal resources or pull. An example of how this could work is that wealthier families could pay to have a doctor give their son a medical excuse for why they were not fit to serve in the military. And this actually happened in many cases during the Vietnam War. So this is another plausible alternate explanation that should have been brought up to satisfy Rule 19, and there should have been evidence against it or evidence in support of its preferred explanation being better than this alternate explanation per Rule 20, and neither one of those was done by this argument. Rule 21 says to expect complexity. This could include things such as raising the possibility of multiple causes for the correlation. Does this argument do that? The answer is no. It just seems to assume that there's only one possible explanation for the correlation, which is that serving in the military per se causes people to earn less money later in life. So overall, how would we evaluate this argument? It does not do a good job of proving its preferred explanation. Another thing to note is that the causal claim it makes is quite extreme. It's talking about military service in general, but the only example or evidence gives is evidence from the war in Vietnam. So the correlation is about the Vietnam War, but its conclusion is about military service in general. It does not even do a great job of creating evidence for the correlation of military service and less lifetime earnings. So that, together with the fact that it doesn't really do a good job of bringing up and ruling out alternate explanations or considering multiple causes, means that its overall effectiveness is poor. However, it must be said, this is not a terrible or worthless argument, because its preferred explanation is at least plausible because of the concept of opportunity cost. It just means it needs further explanation and research. Let's look at another practice problem. Among British people born around 1970, there is a correlation between IQ as a child and vegetarianism as an adult. Those with higher childhood IQs were more likely to be vegetarians as an adult. Researchers considered the possibility that vegetarianism causes a higher IQ. But this would require the vegetarians to have become vegetarians when they were quite young. They found that this was not the case. The vast majority of vegetarians became vegetarians as teenagers or adults, not as children. It's more likely that some other mechanisms are at work. For instance, higher IQ was correlated with greater educational attainment, which is correlated with vegetarianism. Perhaps having a higher IQ causes more education, which causes an increased likelihood of becoming a vegetarian. Even when researchers factored out education, however, they still saw a significant link between IQ and vegetarianism. More directly then, maybe higher IQs increase the likelihood that one will respond to evidence about the health and other benefits of vegetarianism. There is presumably some mix of various mechanisms at work there. So let's begin by looking for the causal claim that this argument makes. We can see the causal claim in the last two sentences. It says, more directly then, maybe higher IQs increase the likelihood that one will respond to evidence about the health and other benefits of vegetarianism. The phrase increase the likelihood is actually the causal indicator. It's saying that the IQ itself is causing the vegetarianism. The last sentence also makes a causal claim by saying there's presumably some mix of various mechanisms at work there. So it's saying that higher IQ causes vegetarianism, but it could be via a mix of specific causal mechanisms or pathways. But that's still part of the causal claim it's making. Now let's evaluate this argument using the rules from Chapter 5. Rule 18 says causal arguments start with correlations. So, does this argument have a correlation at its base? The answer is yes. You can see that in the first two sentences. It says, among British people born around 1970, there is a correlation between IQ as a child and vegetarianism as an adult. Those with higher childhood IQs were more likely to be vegetarians as an adult. So that's stating the correlation between IQ and vegetarianism. Rule 19 says correlations may have alternate explanations. Does this argument do a good job of raising alternate explanations for the correlation other than the one that it prefers? The answer is yes. If you look at sentence 3, it raises a specific alternate explanation. Researchers considered the possibility that vegetarianism causes a higher IQ. So that would be a reverse direction of causation. This argument prefers the explanation that higher IQ causes vegetarianism, but here it seriously considers an alternate possibility, which is that vegetarianism is the cause of higher IQ and not vice versa. Rule 20 says work towards the most likely explanation. Does this argument do a good job of ruling out the alternate explanations and working towards its favored explanation as the most likely? The answer is yes. Look at the second clause in sentence 3. It says, but this would require the vegetarians to have become vegetarians when they were quite young. They found that this was not the case. The vast majority of vegetarians became vegetarians as teenagers or adults, not as children. So in other words, it's explaining why it's not plausible that vegetarianism causes a higher IQ. And the basic reason is that children had a high IQ before they became vegetarians rather than the reverse. And so if vegetarianism were causing the higher IQ, we would expect to see young children being vegetarians and then this showing up in their IQ scores rather than the reverse, which was what was actually found. So in other words, this argument does at least a good job of following rules 19 and 20 by considering one other plausible alternate explanation, the reverse direction of causation, and giving specific evidence that why that explanation is not possible or plausible. It would have done an even better job by considering other alternate explanations and ruling those out, but it does at least a good job following rules 19 and 20. What about Rule 21? Does this argument do a good job exploring various possible causal complexities related to the correlation between high IQ and vegetarianism? The answer is yes, and it specifically does so by looking at the causal mechanisms or pathways through which high IQ might cause vegetarianism. Now, when we discussed Rule 21 in the Chapter 5 video on Rule 21, we mainly focused on the possibility of multiple causes and the interaction between different causes. However, another type of causal complexity is the mechanism, route, or pathway by which one factor influences another. So if you look at the second half of this argument, it's doing a good job trying to hone in on the exact mechanism by which high IQ may cause vegetarianism. It says, for instance, higher IQ was correlated with greater educational attainment, which is correlated with vegetarianism. Perhaps having a higher IQ causes more education, which causes an increased likelihood of becoming a vegetarian. So it's considering another possible causal pathway. It's saying maybe higher IQ doesn't directly cause vegetarianism, but rather via the route of higher education. People with high IQ have greater educational attainment, and it's the greater education that causes them to become vegetarians. But it rules that out. It says even when researchers factored out education, however, they still saw a significant link between IQ and vegetarianism. That is, you would look at people with high IQ and rule out their higher education and look if you could see if you could still find a correlation between those high IQ people and being vegetarian, even if they didn't have high education. And the answer was yes, they did still see a correlation even when there was no education, there was no higher education present with the higher IQ. So it further goes on in a nuanced way to suggest its conclusion. It says maybe higher IQs increase the likelihood that one will respond to evidence about the health and other benefits of vegetarianism. So it's suggesting another causal pathway for high IQ causing vegetarianism other than education. Specifically, high IQ people might be better at understanding and responding to evidence of the benefits of vegetarianism. So overall, how would we evaluate this argument? It does a good job. First of all, it clearly raises an alternate explanation, which is reverse causation. It gives a specific explanation for why that alternate explanation is not plausible. We see the high IQ in children before we see them becoming vegetarians as an adult. It does consider another causal mechanism, which is that high IQ increases education and that the education is the direct cause to becoming vegetarian. But it rules that out by showing that even if you factor out education, there's still a correlation between high IQ people and becoming a vegetarian. And notice how qualified and nuanced the conclusion is. It says, there is presumably some mix of various mechanisms at work there. Oftentimes the best causal arguments are those that acknowledge the complexity, either of multiple causes or, as in this case, of multiple mechanisms by which high IQ may bring about vegetarianism. So overall, it does a good job, and it's a nice example of how scientific research is often relatively careful in trying to draw causal claims out of evidence for correlations. Next up, new chapter, extended arguments. This is actually skipping ahead to chapter 7, which is the way my critical thinking course is structured. If you're using a workbook for arguments textbook with another class, you might be moving on instead to chapter 6, which is about deductive arguments.